Thank you. Good afternoon, learners. As I was told that you have already completed 12 units from Sociology of Religion, and I'll be starting the 13th one. So that's where we would begin. We have in today's session we have two theories. One is Clifford Geertz, and the other is Levi-Strauss. And then we will move into some of the case studies of certain religious forms. So we'll be talking about the Sikh community, and if time permits, maybe we'll take up some other community. So let's see how we go about it. I just have prepared one slide for the session. I just want you to have a look. Let me just give me a moment. Yes. So it is about, I believe you can see the slides, each one of you. You can see the slides. Slide ta disuchi ki nahi kiye jane kahi diyo. No response. So I believe you should be able to see the slide. Okay, I'll just start. Talking about Clifford Geertz. I don't know you have heard him earlier or not, but he is one of the finest anthropologists who actually, talked about. We mostly say that he's a symbolic anthropologist. ଆପଣ ମାନେ ଯଦି ଦେଖିବେ ଟିକେ ଯଦି ମାନେ if you I don't know previous classes रे what how you have approached this entire topic, but I just want to give you a brief intro into various uh, perspectives of looking at things or doing research before I start talking about Clifford Geertz. If you look at the initial pages of sociology, we had a what you can say an obsession for positivist methods. We started off with our classical thinkers, be it Auguste Comte, Immanuel Durkheim, the so-called forefathers. They had the tilt was slightly towards positivist methods. Positivist methods रे कोन ना यूजुअली हमें नेचुरल साइंसेस रे से माने जो प्रकार मेथड सब अप्लाई करूथिले हमें सेही प्रकार मेथड चेष्टा करू सोशल साइंस रे पूरा कॉपी पेस्ट करके जेमति कि इवन it's not copy paste, but we can follow the same principles, the same guideline, so that we can study societies. So basically what we were trying to see is we were trying to take up the methods and the strategies that natural sciences was using, so that we can discover our own laws. काल के कौन प्रेडिक्ट करिया को चाहिबो सोशल साइंसेस रे भी हम गोटे लॉज तैयारी कर दे परिबो जेमति हमर किछटा नेचुरल साइंसेस रे लॉज अछि सपोज न्यूटनियन लॉ कहबो कि जो ऊपर को जोटा जीवो सेटा तळबो you have the force of gravity, then every action has a equal reaction. एमति जेमति किछ नेचुरल साइंसेस रे लॉज अछि हमें चेष्टा करथुलु सोशल साइंसेस रे किछ सेमति लॉज डिस्कवर करिया पे and we had as I told you an obsession for these positivist methods. But there were thinkers like Weber, Karl Mannheim, एमती किछटा thinkers थिले जो माने को लागिला कि जे come on, we are talking about human societies. आमे मनुष्यक विषय कथा कहूछु ए माने these are not objects. Object माने गोटे situation को react करिवे, they will react to a stimuli. But as human beings, we behave in a particular situation, we don't react, and there are so many things into it. For instance, suppose mu kahibi je gote object ke gote suppose there is a paperweight on my table right now, mu kahibi e paperweight ta ku mu jodi etiki degree re etiki speed re phopadibi, it will end up at a particular distance. Every time I do it, I will find the same result. But in case of human beings, can we predict such a thing? mu kahibi daily mu apan ko dhakka maribi, maybe you will fall at a particular distance for a day or two. Next third day you will give me a push कि मुंडा खराब हे गलानी मते एमती कोन थेला मारचंती एमती कोन करचंती. So as human beings we cannot simply be compared to the to natural objects or to artificial objects and the way they behave. We have a different way of doing it. So that was the very essence of Geertz understanding. and his methods. He, at the crux of it, he was greatly influenced by Weberian interpretive understanding. Max Weber, unlike the other positivist trending sociologists like Comte or Durkheim, Weber believed that as human beings, we we have this ability to step into somebody else's shoes. ମୁଁ suppose ଦେଖିବି ଯେ ଆଜି ଆଜି ତମେ ମୁହଁଟା କାଇଁ ଶୁଖେଇଛ, ମୁଁ ଭାବିବି ଆଚ୍ଛା ଆଜି କଣ ହେଇଥିବ ତା ସାଙ୍ଗେ, ଘରେ ଏମିତି କିଛି ଗୋଟେ କିଏ କହିଦେଲା କି କଣ ଅସୁବିଧା ହେଲା କି, I will always try to put myself in your position. ତମ ସ୍ଥାନରେ ନିଜକୁ ରଖିକି ମୁଁ ଦେଖିବାକୁ ଚେଷ୍ଟା କରିବି ଯେ କଣ ହେଇଛି. So Gritz was trying to take up those approach जोटा कि हमें interpretive approach कहते, which was borrowed from Weber's interpretive sociology, Verstehen approach जोटा से कहते. से कौन ना, as a researcher you need not observe things like an observer. But outsider है कि मैं observe करिबिनी. There is a perspective. How do I look at things? ଗୋଟେ actor's perspective अच्छी, आउ ଗୋଟେ observer's perspective अच्छी. So से जो actor टा से situation रे, जे really से situation रे पड़ीची, से केमती feel करूची, से केमती देखुची. I will try to look into those things. So that was one of the initial inspirations of Gitz, and he used the same approach to study social systems, social change, how power distribution takes place in a society. So basically he was taking the help of this interpretive approach, and that was the reason why we said that he was a symbolic anthropologist basically. And as I told you, he used the same approach to study culture. And basically, his entire engagement was into cultural studies, and being an anthropologist, he was trying to look into the cultures of different societies, and he actually found one thing problematic. That was the term culture and the way it was defined. I don't know, if you take up any standard textbook's definition of this term culture, and one of the famous definition was given by, I think, E.B. Tyler. तम text एडाको नाही. I'm just trying to support it with some existing you know framework so that it will help you in understanding this thing. If you look at Tyler's definition, Tyler almost included everything under the sun that was man-made, or that was created by human beings as culture. So he found that culture is an umbrella term, no doubt, because everything comes under this umbrella of culture. Because he decided, if you look at A.B. Tyler's definition, he defined culture as the sum total of beliefs, values, artifacts, material things, non-material things, everything. माने गोटे मो बिलीफ सिस्टम जहा मो को वैल्यूज रे विश्वास रखुची, ए टेबल टा, चेयर टा, कंप्यूटर टा, everything is a part of culture. So when you have so many things categorized under one group, there lies the problem according to Gitz. Gitz कहले कि it's too vague. एमती अदर विराट बड़ा umbrella term नहीं कि हमें चेष्टा करिबु बुझिया को, it will be analytically too weak. No, it's not going to help us. And that was the reason for him, culture was something, he started, he said that let me first try to arrive at a definition for culture. Because ये जो definition टा, जो existing definition टा culture रो अच्छी, याकू नहीं कि I cannot make a strong argument when it comes to analysis of certain things. And for him, he started defining that culture denotes a historically transmitted pattern of meanings embodied in symbols, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge and attitude towards life. And you would see that when he is trying to make this kind of a definition, his definition is basically about certain symbolic forms by which we are trying to communicate, and at the same time we are accumulating certain knowledge. So basically it's a system of symbols. Symbols again, it plays a very important role in what you say in one's life. And if you look at Gates' analysis of religion, he starts with Durkheim's conception of the sacred and the profane. I think you might have been taught Durkheim. Durkheim आपण मानकु पढ़ाई साथिबो, and somewhere Durkheim is actually using this concept of sacred and profane. Sacred quota, profane quota. Anything that comes under the purview of religion, that's a sacred thing, and anything apart from that is profane. For example, ମୁଁ ଆପଣଙ୍କୁ ଗୋଟେ example ଦେବି, ଗୋଟେ ପଥରଟେ suppose ରାସ୍ତାରେ ପଡିଛି, you might kick it as a football, ତମେ ବଲ ଭଳିଆ ତାକୁ ଗୋଇଠା ମାରି ମାରି ଚାଲୁଥିବ, ସେଇ ସେମ୍ ପଥରଟାକୁ ତା ଆର ଦିନ ଜଣେ ଆଣି ଗୋଟେ ସିନ୍ଦୁର ଟିପା ଲଗେଇକି ଗୋଟେ ଗଛ ତଳେ ଥୋଇଦବ, that becomes a sacred thing. ତା ପୂର୍ବରୁ ସେଟା profane ଥିଲା। କି for example ତମେ ଗୋଟେ ଠାକୁରଙ୍କର ଫଟୋ କିଣିକି ଆଣିଲ ବଜାରରୁ, ଯେତେ ପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ବଜାରରେ ଥିଲା ତମେ ବ୍ୟାଗରେ ପୁରେଇକି ଆଣିଲ, ତମେ ପରିବା ସାଙ୍ଗେ ତାକୁ ବି ପକେଇକି ଆଣିଲ, it was it belonged to the category of profane, ସେଟା sacred ହେଇକି ନଥିଲା। କିନ୍ତୁ the moment you established it in your ପୂଜା room, ତାକୁ ଯାଇକି ଠାକୁର ଘରେ ତମେ ରଖିକି ପୂଜା ଆରମ୍ଭ କରିଦେଲ, ସେଟା sacred ର connotation ପାଇଗଲା। So that is how Durkheim is trying to make uh, a distinction between the sacred and the profane. And if you look at the idea of sacred, it is represented by certain symbols. जहाँ भी हमें religion कथा हमें जितने बड़े भी कहूँ, religion टा सब बड़े किछिटा symbols द्वारा ही it is expressed. And mostly if you talk about religion, religion is something that aligns human action to the cosmic order. So if you talk about human beings out of their collective imagination, they have created a cosmic order that is sacred. And we tend to, fall back upon that cosmic order again and again. Suppose maybe there are certain answers in life that we seek for. କାହିଁକି ବଞ୍ଚିଛି, ମୋ ଲାଇଫର purpose କ'ଣ? ହଁ ସକାଳେ ଉଠିକି ଖାଉଛି ପିଉଛି ଶୋଉଛି, but is that why I was born for? କାହିଁକି ମୁଁ ଜନ୍ମ ନେଇଛି? I have certain questions like this, and which is associated with certain apparent meaninglessness of life, which may bother people, and we tend to find answers. या आंसर आ केही दे परिबेनी। सपोज जदि कोई कथटा मो मार्क पचारिबी जे मो काहे की बंचिची, मार्क पचारि कोन खाइछु पिइछु बंचिछु तो असुविधाटा कोन हेबा। So is that the answer to it? I will always try to find the answer, and if you talk it from a very rationalist perspective, people will find it very absurd. But from a religious perspective, only religious, certain religious, what you say, framework can give a particular answer to these kind of questions. So, and in the life, the बहुत meaninglessness of life को नहीं की absurdity of life को नहीं की, we are faced with many problems which bother people, and they need answers to that. And this is where these religious symbols they come out in trying to bridge this gap between reality और जो cosmic order जोटा कि हमें believe करूँ कि there is a cosmic order, there is a divine justice, एमती कले एमती हबो, हमको फल मिलिबो। एबे सिना जणे सक्सेसफुल से हे जाउची, अनफेयर मीन्स नहीं कि किंतु दिने टाइम आसीबो, I will be recognized out वो जिनसटा ठीक से ये हबो। So in the very process, Gates was trying to define religion, and in his definition, he says that religion is nothing but a system of symbols. What a system of symbols. The moment you enter a temple or enter any religious site, be it a church, be it a mosque, you will see that it is surrounded with certain symbols. तमरो क्रॉस हे पारो क्रिश्चियनिटी रो, कि तमरो त्रिशूल हे पारो, कि द मोमेंट्स द आइडल्स, कि प्रत्येक ऑब्जेक्ट तमे सिंदूर लगौछ, चंदन लगौछ, द काइंड ऑफ environment it is created there, everything is symbolic, everything has certain meaning. And secondly, he says that it says that this system of symbol it actually acts to establish certain powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in people. And he says, what he's trying to say is that it's something that will motivate you, that will create a certain kind of mood in you. आज मनटा भल लागुनी आई नीड टू विजिट द टेम्पल मु मंदिर जेबी कि मु जाई कि एका बसिबी एकांतरे भगवान को पाखु भगवान को स्मरण करिबी why do I need this because he says that it is important for establishing these particular kind of moods and motivations and at the same time formulating certain conceptions of a general order of existence. There is an order of existence and how do I look at this entire thing and at the same time it has certain uh, factuality associated with it and everything the moods and motivations that it creates everything seems so realistic when whenever I'm talking about religion and he makes an attempt. Gitz is making an attempt to examine the meaning of religious symbols. So for him, culture is a system of symbol, and religion is it being an important part of culture is also symbolic. And that's why Gitz says that there is a difference between religious symbols that is sacred and other realms of life. Anything that is associated with religion, it becomes sacred. Sacred boli kahuchu. And anything apart from that is profane. Onye jinso gudaku profane ro rupa neyijibo. So the division between the sacred and the profane, it exists, and at the same time you will see that it actually elicits multiple meaning. And whenever we talk about these religious symbols, it has a vehicle of conception, and it's like a vehicle. It can be used as an object, as an act, an event, or a quality, or it can represent an idea. But a symbol तार बहुत power रही है. माने just got a religious symbol को नहीं कि it can take me to a different state of mind. And he believes that religion is a system of symbols. Religion का किसी नहीं बट system of symbol woven into an ordered whole. सब symbol जब orderly related and it is uncritically accepted in every society. तमे जो जेकोसी भी सोसाइटी अछि तमे देखिबो कि जे सब रिलीजन रो गोटेना किछि गोटे सिंबल अछि and those symbols are actually important in creating a coherent ordered world for human beings. He you just see that kids here is giving an example from Japanese society. So Japanese society se we study करथिले and he found that those who do not prescribe to these religious norms are considered to be non-Japanese. It तांका पे non-Japanese माने human like tendencies में माने अति छोटा छुआर behavior टा non-Japanese से माने कहिबे because से छुआटा किछि जाने पाउनी कि जणे जहरटे morality नाही जणे गोटे culprit जणे गोटे criminal सेमतिया लोक को भी से माने non-Japanese कहिबे जोडा जहार भी से माने non-human like qualities देखिबे because those things, those people who do not prescribe to the religious norms of their existing society, ତାକୁ ସେମାନେ non-Japanese ବୋଲି କହୁଥିଲେ ଆଖ୍ୟା ଦେଉଥିଲେ and ଏଠି ଗୋଟେ example ଦେଇଛନ୍ତି Gitz, it's there in your reading material. He says that ଗୋଟେ Japanese mystic who is actually staring into the flame of the lamp ର flame ଟାକୁ ଏମିତି ଅନେଇଛି अब बहुत समय आम रिलीजन रे भी थाए ना तमे एमती फ्लेम को गोटे अनै कि तमे मेडिटेट करिया को चेष्टा करो कि गोटे पर्टिकुलर पॉइंट को देखि यू ट्राई टू मेडिटेट सो बेसिकली द रीजन बिहाइंड इज दैट इट इंस्टिल्स a certain what you say a certain kind of self discipline and it tries to control your emotions suppose बहुत कांद लागुची बहुत राग लागुची आमे कहा जाए छे छे तू तो इमोशंस को कंट्रोल कर, यू डोंट हैव एनी कंट्रोल ओवर योर इमोशंस एंड इफ यू ट्राई डूइंग यू ट्राई टू मेडिटेट, तमे मेडिटेट करो देखिबो इट विल बी वेरी हेल्पफुल टू यू। तेणु एठी मेडिटेशन माने इट्स लाइक it's like venting out, you are like controlling your emotions। से जो अत्यधिक राग लागुतला मते गोटे पॉइंट रे लागुतला कि जणको पिटी पकेइबी कि मो एमिति कांदा लागुतला, I was not able to control that, because those movements are actually influential in what you say, influential in giving a particular controlled emotional expression, and that's one of the major functions of religion. And you know he has also given another example when he says that ତମ ମନ ବହୁତ ଖରାପ ଅଛି ଆଉ ତମେ ପୁରା ହେଲ୍ପଲେସଲି କାନ୍ଦୁଛ, ତମେ ଯେତେବେଳେ କାନ୍ଦୁଛ ତମେ you need some space of privacy, and at that time you try to identify with your god। ସେ କିଏ ବି ହେଇପାରନ୍ତି, it could be an idol, ଗୋଟେ ମୂର୍ତ୍ତି ହେଇପାରେ, ଗୋଟେ ଫଟୋ ହେଇପାରେ, କି ମନେ ମନେ ତମେ କାହାକୁ ଟିକେ ସ୍ମରଣ କର। ଆଉ ଯେତେବେଳେ ତମକୁ ଲାଗେ କି ସବୁ ରାସ୍ତା ବନ୍ଦ ହେଇସାରିଛି, you are trying to have some divine intervention, कि अच्छा भगवान आसीबे कि किए मते गोटे एथु ए जो डिलेमा रो बाहर करिवे, मते एथु उद्धार करिवे। So it's a world belief that has been instilled in us। हम भितर एटा अछि जे हां it has a divine reality achi, and somebody will be taking me out of this position, and life will be better after that। You will here see that symbols play a very important role in creating certain moods and motivations in us। There is a difference between mood and motivation, what Git has said। ଆମେ mood କାହାକୁ କହିବା ଆଉ ଆମେ motivation କାହାକୁ କହିବା। If you will see that no, mood is actually a kind of what you say, it's a kind of uh, state of mind। I don't know if you look at your reading material, तमर ଗୋଟେ material रे ଗୋଟେ example ଦେଇଛି ଯେ mood is actually a scalar entity and motivation is a vector entity। school level physics रे पढ़ा ହେଇଥିବ ଯେମିତି कि I don't want to go into those details, but if you will see, suppose I will see that I'll just give you an example। school level physics re tamane padhithiba the difference between velocity and speed। what is the difference between velocity and speed? Normally tamo bohi re thae je velocity is a vector entity and speed is a scalar entity। So similarly Git sethi कहउचंती जे mood and motivation, they are like speed and velocity। mood is just a state of mind। तमे जते ଗୋଟେ religious symbol को देखुचो, when you look into a symbol or anything, it just gives takes you to a state of mind। ता माने नाही कि जे तमे एटा कर दियो, ଗୋଟେ direction दे देला मु तापर एया करबी सेटा अचीव करबी, it doesn't talk about that। motivation is something like that। religion can give you motivation, which he says is a vector entity, and at the same time it can give you the moods। moods is just a state of mind। मते बहुत दुख लागुतला, I was in extreme pain, से टाइम मो जाईकी निजको बंद करकी मु ठाकुर का आगे कांदी देली हेल्पलेस हेकी। जेतेबेले when I was looking into the lamp, जो दीपटा जळी थिला, that created a different sort of mood in me। मोर जो एंगर थिला मते से एमिति कहि देले, से जो भितरे जो क्रोध जो ये हठात it lapses out, it just evaporates। आउ से जो दीपटा को जेतेबेले मु अनेकी रहूची, it takes me to a different mood। और से mood टा कोन, that mood is हठात गोटे extreme state of emotions, anger गोटे peace और tranquility आड़ को मते नै गला। And I started seeing things कि नहीं मुझे भूल कली, कि मुझे ठीक कली। That is what the power of these religious symbols in bringing a particular mood in you। And motivation is a drive, drive to achieve something कि मैं इटा करीबी मैं सेटा करीबी, it can also have this it can induce motivation, and at the same time it can induce a certain mood in you. And that's what it says, that the most important function of these religious symbols, I mean, symbols are actually meaningless, but that is not the thing. Symbols, they have their own power, and that's what Gits is saying, that it can trigger a certain mood in you. Is it a peace हो, कि tranquility हो, कि a state of joy हो, कि a state of assurance हो, कि okay, somebody is there to look after me, ମୋ ପାଖେ ଭଗବାନ ଅଛନ୍ତି, ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ଜିନିଷଟା, so it triggers a mood in you, if not motivation ନ ହେଇପାରେ, କିନ୍ତୁ mood ଗୋଟେ ନିଶ୍ଚୟ trigger କରିବ. So, at this point, Gibbs is trying to address a particular question, that why does human beings need religious symbols? Religious symbols ro need kona amanako bhitere. Without symbol, hey paribo ki? And at the same time, you will see that there is a kind of a cultural universality everywhere. ସବୁ society କିଛି ନା କିଛି religion ଅଛି, ଆଉ ସବୁ religion ରେ କିଛି ନା କିଛି symbol ଅଛି. It is completely universal. There is no, getting away from that. And if you look at these symbols, symbols are again, symbols, they stand for something else. They actually, talk about something which is not, the meaning is not actually contained in that symbol itself. For example, traffic light. Traffic symbols, they have a new kind of an orientation. Suppose red mane stop, green mane go. The light itself doesn't talk, but it stands for something else. Red mane, and again it is culture specific. Somebody like Saucer would say that it culture specific. That Chinese society re maybe red mane ମୁଁ କହିବି कि go न है कि sorry stop न है कि go हे पारे, और green mane stop हे पारे. It is how the society has created it. And that's Kids is trying to say that basically when he says that there is an important need of religion because religion is nothing but a system of symbols, he is trying to say that there are three chaotic paradoxes, that human beings face in their everyday life. It is bafflement. I'm baffled all the time. I'm in a state of, sometimes in a state of shock, sometimes in a state of surprise. And at the same time, there is suffering. Both suffering thai life. It could be, personal pain, mental pain, physical pain, agony, the loss of, losing somebody, the personal loss. And there are certain ethical paradoxes also. कि मुझे ठीक कली कि भूल कली, यदि गोटे केबे गोटे लागिथिबो कि जे हां गोटे करि देइछि गोटे भूल, my conscience will start hurting me. देखो से जो ethical questions टा, वो ethics कहार केमिति, वो प्रकार ethical values को नहीं कि मु जाउछि, that is also important here. So Gibbs would say that religion plays an important role in addressing these ethical values in you. कि कोटा ठीक कि कोटा भूल, and at the same time माने जेतले गोटे ह्यूमन सफरिंग थाए, सपोज गोटे ट्राइब गोटे सोसाइटी रे when I say कि अच्छा मो संगे एमती काई हैला, सपोज मते ए रोगटा हैला, मो संगे काई हैला, मो कोन भूल करथिली, मु जति कि दूर मने पके पड़छि, माय फ्रेंड्स एमने एते किछि खराब काम करछंती, एमती करछंती, they are still having a good life. And why is it that I have to have this kind of a suffering? ମୁଁ ତ କେବେ ସେମିତି କିଛି କାହାକୁ ହର୍ଟ କରିନି ବି, ଜାଣିକିରି ମୁଁ ଲାଇଫ ରେ କେବେ କିଛି wrong doings ଆଣିନି. Why it happened to me? Why me and why not somebody else? So ଯେତେବେଳେ Gibbs took up these studies in this Javanese society, he said that there are certain beliefs which are used, certain theories which are used again and again to explain situations. The situations may be weird lagi pare, okay, what a weird kind of a thing it is. And at the same time you will see that you will always believe that when you talk about these religious suffering, uh, all religions will say that sufferings cannot be avoided. जे there are again things कि ताहले जदि suffering मु भी suffer करिवि से भी suffer करिवो ताहले मु काहे कि honest हेबी मु जणे यदि कटे करप्ट लोक करप्शन करी कि से आराम से बंची पारुची ताहले एठी honesty रो माने कोन you know every religion will try to manage that kind of dissonance in you कि ना god जो मान को भल पांती those people suffer a lot तमे suffer कले you are actually helping the mankind कि there is a आमे जेमति आमे कहू कि जे कर्म theory of karma अछि तमर पूर्व जन्म र ये तमे सफरिंग ता ई जन्म रे तमे ये कुछ there are so many explanations and मुझे तोरा कहली कि हमर जो लाइफ में किछटा बड़े मीनिंगलेस लागे किछटा पर्टिनेंट क्वेश्चंस थाए जोटा कि गोटे रैशनल पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू रो गोटे माने गोटे लॉजिकल पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू रो you will not find an answer and in those critical hours religion actually gives you those gives certain answers to those basic existential questions as to as to why I have to suffer or what is the reason behind my suffering. So there are certain what you say a, a basic framework and religion religious belief re jo answers achi you may find it strange you may find it illogical but for everything there is an answer se answer tam apna mane au koti paibeni so perhaps that is the reason why for in every society people tend to follow certain religion and religion is such an what you say is universal institution it is found in every society be it an elementary tribal society or a modern kind of a society which is too very advanced in science and technology but there are certain questions that science and technology cannot answer and religion can and that's what Glitz is trying to say that those existential questions that we are baffled with often and when there is suffering all around and we also have certain ethical issues to be managed this is where religion actually makes an entry and at the same time he says that why is it that we tend to believe in religion ଆମ ମୁଣ୍ଡ ଭିତରେ କିଏଟା ପସେଇଲା ଯେ religion is important and we all need to have a religion can I live without a religion what it has to be is it possible to live without a religion normally we say that for example Marxism Karl Marx doesn't believe in religion, and he said that religion is the opium of the masses. And that's the reason Marxists they don't believe in God, they don't have religious institutions. But at the same time, they will find an answer to their problems, and for everything they will, uh, they will replace God with Karl Marx then. So we need what you say, an outline, a guide in at every moment of life. So for that we need a particular guideline, we need a particular what you say uh, framework so that we can actually give answer to the universal questions in a satisfactory way and this is where actually religion plays a role and this and kids would mostly say that people tend to believe in religion it's a matter of socialization the way you have been socialized you will see that जो घर मानकरे बेसी पूजा पाठ करथबे कि बेसी ऑस्टेरिटी मेंटेन करथबे इट विल हैव एन इन्फ्लुएंस इन योर लाइफस्टाइल इधर तमे सेटार पूरा फॉलो करके लाइफ सारा तमे ताको सेमति तमे गोटे ऑस्टेरिटी मेंटेन करथबो कि हां न गाधेले मु खाइबेनी कि मु इटा छुइबेनी मु इटा करिबेनी कि एते विरक्त हो जाइथिबो जे तमे सेटा जमा करिबो so the thing is that you like it or you don't like it it will still have an influence on your life so that is what religion is all about and you will see that if you look at certain what you say certain existence of certain tribal religion you will see that certain kind of authority lies in those traditional imageries and there is a there is a supernatural experience that they believe in there is an experience of oneness, and there is an extraordinary personality जोटा कि वेबर कहता है कि ଗୋଟେ charismatic personality सेटा सबले ଗୋଟେ religious guru रो ହେଇଥାଏ. So there is a religious perspective to things, you know, it's a way of seeing things, and this religious perspective is actually different from other perspective. ମୁଁ ଯେମିତି କହିଲି କି ଯେ suppose there are certain questions as to, I would say ki uh, why certain people are poor and why some people are not poor. I will ask you to analyze this question. What will be your answer if anyone can take this question? कि अच्छा किसी लोग कहीं गरीब थांती और किसी लोग कहीं धनी थांती. What would be your answer? Anyone? No? I just want you to take this question. Jahan bhi manare asuchi, just try to make an attempt, because I just want to point out how a religious interpretation or a perspective varies from other perspectives. Okay, nobody wants to take up this question. Okay, so I will say, suppose okay, I'll stick to this question as to why people are poor. Kona tar explanation hai pare. Some would say that, you know, लोग कहीं गरीब थांती ना, maybe because poor people are not very intelligent, and ସେମାନେ ସେଭ୍ କରିପାରନ୍ତିନି, ସେଭିଂ ସ୍କିଲ୍ସ ତାଙ୍କର ନଥାଏ as the middle class have କି the upper class have. ତେଣୁ it's a problem because you know, ସେମାନଙ୍କର intelligence level ଟିକେ IQ କମ, ତାଙ୍କର ଏଟା କମ. So I will try to give a answer to it. So that could be what you say, a commonsensical answer. And Gitz is trying to say that there are different explanations. What a religious explanation thai paribo, what a commonsensical explanation thai paribo, what a scientific explanation thai paribo. Eta what a commonsensical explanation deli. What a scientific explanation kon hai pare? ଯେମିତି କି कार्ल मार्क्स କହିଲେ कि जे poverty कोन, ତମେ ତ କେହି ତ ମା ପେଟରୁ ଜମି ବାଡି ଧରିକି ଆସି ନଥିଲେ. It was you know, resources were same everywhere. किए को रिसोर्स नहीं पारला, किए नेलानी, किए कोटा को नेला. There is an unequal distribution of resources. Because of this unequal distribution of resources, there is inequality in the society. Then poverty is the reason which reason.
Yes, madam.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes,
madam. Actually, if you want to explain in the religious factor, okay, madam.
Yeah.
Suppose someone belongs to in Brahmin family, okay. His duty is to worship God. If he does not do any work, he may be poor.
Yeah.
Traditionally.
Yeah. Very
Understood.
Good. Yes.
This is the first reason. If you think traditionally, religious factor is more responsible for poor and rich. It can differ in this sense.
Yeah, I'm not talking about religious factor. I'm talking about religious as a perspective. The same explanation can be used as religion for a perspective.
It may be used, na?
Okay, yeah, it can be used. Yeah. So here, when I'm trying to say that you know, there is a scientific explanation to it, there is a commonsensical explanation to it, and at the same time there is a religious explanation to it. When I'm talking about, suppose poverty, here madam gave a good example. Suppose in this context I would say ki, no, there is a karmic theory to that. Purva janmara, you know, poor people, they have the curse of the previous lives. Purva janmare kichhi asubidha haithibo. There can be a religious explanation. This can also be a religious explanation. So there are different ways of looking at things. So the religious perspective, it may not be scientific, it may not be commonsensical. Again, when I talk about common sense, one has to be, you know, very careful, because one of the major aims of sociology as a discipline is to keep common sense at bay. Common sense, you know, normally we have been taught right from the very beginning, from our childhood, that common sense is not very common. But if at all we talk about research, we have to put common sense away, because there is a commonsensical explanation to everything. And it is very dangerous for sociology as a discipline, because mostly we look into a taken for granted world. जदि आमे गोटे न्यूक्लियर साइंस विषय कहबा very less people can actually participate in the discussion, because since we are talking about society and everybody has an explanation for the events or phenomena that is taking place, it is so very, taken for granted knowledge. There is a chance that these commonsensical explanations, perspectives would re-emerge again and again. So as the duty of a sociologist would be to keep this commonsensical perspective away, we have to stick to the scientific principles. And this is how, Gates is trying to talk about different kinds of perspective whenever we are talking about any phenomena or any event. And there is a religious perspective, and he believes that this perspective is very important for the believers. The non-believers may shrug it off and try to say that it's an unscientific, or it's a thing of the past, or it's a kind of belief system which is irrational. But for a believer, this kind of a perspective actually shapes his or her worldview. And there is another aspect of religion that Gates is trying to talk about, that is through ritual performance. Why do, okay, when I say that we need religion in our life, is it important to have rituals? ମୁଁ ପୂଜାଟା କଲା ବେଳକୁ ଆଗ ଫୁଲ ଦେବି, ଘଣ୍ଟି ବଜେଇବି, କି ମୁଁ ପାଣି ଚଢେଇକି ଭୋଗଟା ଛଡେଇବି? Why do I need to do these things? So, okay, I believe that always we need certain support, we need certain guideline in our lives, and that is where the role of religion creeps in. But if at all I am talking about rituals, how is ritual justified in one's life? And we have always, despised rituals, because ritualistic hele life re bahut asubidha huye, ye huye, and we tend to be more and more non-ritualistic. That's what we have been preaching all these days. So what was the role of rituals at the very first place? That is what Gates is trying to say. And he says that more or less, rituals, when they're performed, they have actually certain roles to play. And when I'm talking about the roles of these rituals, you will see that rituals, they they confirm, they tend to confirm your faith in religion. They reinforce your faith in religion every time you perform a ritual, because ritual is nothing but it's again an interplay of the symbols that religion has woven into your world, and at the same time it's trying to give meaning to the worldviews that you have taken up. And they also generate the kind of ideas that we always believe that when I follow this religion, when I worship this particular kind of god, he or she, the god gives me a direction in life. मते एमिति थिला अवस्था तापरे मते लागला मते बाबा मते रास्ताटा देखैले से जो रास्ताटा मते देखौछंती सेटा थ्रू रिचुअल्स जनरेट हुए बोली बहुत लोक भाबंती. And kids could observe that somewhere the role of rituals become important in a religious life, because had that been the thing, religion would have been just a body of knowledge, or it would have been synonymous to spirituality. But here we are not talking about spirituality. It is how in everyday life, how religion is actually plays its role, and it's enacted, it's performed, and it is the performativity of religion comes through rituals. That was the take of Gates about religion. Now I would talk about. You want to? You have any doubts on Gates' entire synthesis, Gates' ideas on religion? If you have any, you can just point me out right now. We will try to have a discussion. If not, I will move into the next section. That is because we are also running out of time. We'll be talking about Levi-Strauss. So Levi-Strauss. So I guess you don't have any questions now. Levi-Strauss, you will see that basically he was a structuralist. He was considered to be a structural anthropologist. And anybody can you tell me what is structuralism about? What could be the basic thesis of structuralism? Let me just continue. You will see that.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
you are asking structuralism.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I guess when in society there are many institutions, and the institutions there are people in the institutions, they play different roles, and over a period of time these roles get institutionalized further, and I think that structure gets created. Is it?
Very, very good. Okay, that's about structure. So yeah. Anything else you want to add? Okay.
No, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. So basically, he was trying to say that how structures are created and how the institutions get metamorphosized to become structures of the society. And Levi-Strauss is considered to be a structuralist because somewhere he was trying to look into certain deep, innate, invisible structures of the society. If you just try to make a comparison between say zoology and the structures of the society, you will find some semblances. I'll tell you. Suppose if you look at landscapes, somewhere you will find mountains, somewhere you will find valleys, somewhere you will find rivers. A geologist can answer it better. They believe that there are certain underlying structures of the earth. अर्थ भितर स्ट्रक्चर जेमिति हेथिबो से ऊपरटा से सेही अनुसार मैनेज्ड हबो जदि कोठी गोटे वोल्केनिक आउटलेट अछि तेनो से गोटे माउंटेन्स क्रिएट हे जिवो ता माने ता भितर बहुत मोल्टेन मटेरियल अछि ता भितर स्ट्रक्चर ता डिटरमाइन करूछु ऊपर स्ट्रक्चर ता केमति हबो सो सिमिलरली if you look at the structuralist perspective, structuralism also believes that it's the deep underlying things within that creates the external manifested structures. And if you look at Levi-Strauss was actually it's not only just in sociology. If you take up the views of Sigmund Freud, for example, Sigmund Freud also talks about the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious, and he says it is basically the unconscious is actually the underlying structure within. So all your fear, your anxiety, your personality, everything is hooked up within that unconscious. So structuralism is actually an interplay of the structures. And as you said that it's nothing but the practices that get crystallized. So that crystallizes into a structure which after some period of time becomes very difficult to change because it works as a permanent structure of the society. And if you look at the work of Levi-Strauss was actually popular for his study on kinship system, and which was known as alliance theory because alliance in French means marriage. And he actually talked about exchange of women, because basically when you're talking about kinship system, it is nothing but the very act of women moving out of one household to another. And that is why he says there is it is because of these kind of relationship between two groups that a kind of kinship system is maintained. So basically he is trying to give a very reduce this entire system to a structuralist analysis. And one of the important proponents of structuralism is the interplay of binary opposites that you will see in all the it's reflected in all the works of Levi-Strauss. Interplay of binary, for example, when you say that the role of opposites, we cannot have an experience of the day unless we realize what the night is like. जदि रावण न थांता हुए तो हमें राम को जानी न थांते तेनो तने बाइनरी ऑपोजिट्स है वी एक्चुअली the good becomes good when there is the presence of evil जे evil टा एते खराब जे good टा सेते की भल लागिला so you will find that reflection all through in Levi-Strauss's work, and basically his works on the cooked and the raw in the savage mind. He is actually talking about this interplay of structures, and uh, whenever we tend to talk about Levi-Strauss, there was one, and basically Levi-Strauss on religion, we actually tend to think of his work on totemism. And totemism, this concept, I believe, is not new to you because you already have, you have read it in Durkheim, and there are so many scholars, there are so many thinkers who have talked about totemism. And his work on totemism, it was important because I just try to say that if you talk about this entire institution of totemism, it is basically seen in tribal societies. Even Amalaka society review, we have these signs, these totems in our lives. The basic idea is that the members of a particular clan, they consider themselves to have descended from a particular plant or a particular tree or an inanimate object. जेमति कि आपण माने देखिथिबे माणबसा गुरुवार रे माण जोटा थाए आपण माने कहिरे that can be a totem for us. So सेटा animate object हे पारे, inanimate object हे पारे, but when we tend to say कि गोटे animate object, गोटे plant रो कि गोटे animal रो गोटे totem रो हमें emerge करचे गोटे particular clan किबा group, they tend to refrain from killing or eating that particular plant or animal, and they may not sacrifice it, or there are certain taboos, certain restrictions that is associated with totem. So basically he says he did not believe that certain thing like totemism ever existed. He was not trying to answer ki acha what is this totemism, how it emerged or anything. He was basically trying to see that how this totemic phenomena is actually taken into account, and how to study the phenomena that that happened to be totemic. That was his concern, and he was rather less interested in what is the substance of totemism or what contains in totemism. He was basically he was trying to look at that totemism as a phenomenon, and how are these totemic phenomena arranged, from time to time, how it's interpreted and reinterpreted. So these were his basic concerns. And firstly, he rejected some of the popular theses that was taken up by anthropologists of those times, be it Boas or Ruby or Royber, and he believed that it's totemism is not an entity in itself; it's not a reality. So in Durkheimian term, he would say that totemism is not sui generis. In other words, it doesn't have its own existence. It will not have its own laws. Rather, it is a product. It is a product of the lives that these primitives, the way they have lived, or they try to identify each other. How the social groups formation took place in those times. कि अच्छा group formation केमिति हेतिबो से एई group को belong करे ये से एई group को belong करे कोटा के animal group कोटा के plant group. Present day society review, we have these kind of totems. So that's what Levi-Strauss is find certain explanation to these kind of phenomena, and he actually criticizes the functional views of totemism as well. For example, what does Durkheim say? Durkheim says that totemism is something that in the context of religion, Durkheim says that it creates solidarity. It creates a kind of a community which which binds its members together, and that's what he says, that when he talks about the church is even this idea of moral binding, a moral community that keeps its members binding, it's reflected in every aspect of Durkheim's work, be it his studies on suicide or religion or his methods. You'll find it everywhere. So, and when you talk about Malinowski and his study on those Tropian islanders, uh, that you will see that they also have totems, and they believe that the totem has certain utilitarian values. So, Malinowski gives an explanation in terms of utilitarianism, but he would say that there are totems which are not utilitarian, and at the same time it is valued in a particular kind of society. And when Durkheim is trying to talk about social solidarity in a particular society, uh, Levi-Strauss is trying to challenge that, saying that what about societies with religious pluralism? When a single religion doesn't bring them together. So how do you explain those kind of societies? So that is how he started talking about uh, a different narrative on this entire belief and practices of totemism, and at the same time he said that it's just a product of human mind, and he tries to you know define this phenomena and try to make a relationship between one or two, the one a person or object, and he was trying to, what you say, evaluate this entire uh, phenomena by trying to create a complete structure so that it would be intelligible to human minds. And remember, these concepts have been drawn from the primitive minds, and it is he was actually trying to understand how the primitive mind works. And that's why he says that when you are talking about totemism actually falls into two series. One is natural series and other is the cultural series, and a relationship that is established between this natural series and the cultural series. And remember, when he is talking about the nature and the culture, there is again, as I told you earlier, that structuralism is based on certain dichotomies, certain binary opposites. And here Levi-Strauss, when he is pointing out on these two series, that is natural because it involves plants and animals, and that is and tries to create certain association with human groups. It is about certain it is about the relationship that is uh, constructed between nature and culture. And that's how he says that the problem of totemism arises because there are two separate chains of experience. We are talking about the nature and we are talking about the culture. And that's how he says that uh, these two experiences, they can be overlapping, and at the same time the entire you know the myriad patterns we say, it has been created from this nature versus culture phenomena. And Levi-Strauss, at the same time says that the example, he's trying to give the example of the first Australian totemism, that that is that where he's trying to establish a relationship between certain natural and cultural groups. And he believes that the same kind of phenomena you will find it elsewhere also. And the, the way a kind of a totem is actually associated with a particular kind of a human group, it actually gives rise to myriads cultural practices. And again, when he's trying to make an analysis of totemism, he firstly he tries to go through the works of Coates, Pritchard, and who actually has given the theory of totemism. Then Radcliffe Brown, and know, in this entire process, he is trying to explain the very content and forms of this entire theoretical framework. And he is again, if you look at people like Brown or Malinowski, or take for example Firth or Force, you will see that they are trying to again think of the relationship between the totemic system and the natural species, and it is based on certain perception of resemblance. Kichute resemblance rahichi because ସେମାନେ ମେ ବି ଦ୍ୟାଟ ଗ୍ରୁପ ସେମାନେ ଏଇଟାକୁ ରିଜମ୍ବଲ କରୁଛନ୍ତି ତା ଟ୍ରେଟ୍ ଗୁଡାକ ଏମିତିଆ ସୋ ମାନେ ଦେ ଆର୍ ଭେରି ଫିୟର୍ସ ଅର୍ ଦେ ଆର୍ ଭେରି what you say active କି alert ତେଣୁ ଟାଇଗର ତାଙ୍କ ଟୋଟେମ ହେଇପାରେ କି ହେଇପାରିବ ତେଣୁ it is basically structuralism ଟା ସବୁବେଳେ ଗୋଟେ ମଣିଷ ଗୋଟେ how does a primitive man think, how the primitive man actually acts in an environment ସେ ତାର ଆଖପାଖରେ ଯାହା ଦେଖେ ତାକୁ ନେଇକି କେମିତି ଗୋଟେ systematic social coherent order create करे. Totemism is an example of that actually, and based on these previous theories, Redcliffe Brown is trying to say that totemism का किसी ये टन ऑफ परे माने as such totemism कौन का function कौन it may not interest me, but the thing is that how this phenomena of this totemic phenomena, the way it creates groups and the way it goes on from one society to another, that is actually of importance, and that's why he says that uh, totemism is can actually be a mode of classification in a primitive society. When you don't have a system of classification, totemism provides you that idiom to classify uh, the society, and it actually is a means of thinking, and it's not governed by any kind of it's highly simplistic so that the primitive mind can pick it up and can associate things very easily, and basically the functions that totemism fulfills are cognitive and intellectual, because that is how an intellectual mind works in a primitive era. Primitive era re to semane there was no other intellectual activity, so this was actually a kind of function that they could carry out in the primitive era, and that's why he points out that totems are not good to eat. Totems ke khanti nahi. They are good to think. So it's food for thought, what we say. And the problem of totemism disappears when we realize that all humans at all points of time are concerned with one or other mode of classification, and these classifications they can operate in many ways, in terms of differentiation, in terms of composition or substitution, and there is a general norm to that, and to illustrate this, he is giving an example where he says that suppose a society has three clans. Say there is this example Levi-Strauss has given. He says that bear is a clan, which means land. Eagle is a clan, which means sky, and turtle is its clan, which means water. And because of demographic changes, the bear clan becomes extinct. But the turtle clan, enlarges, and in the course of time, it splits into two. The society faces this change in two ways. First, the same totemic association might be preserved in a damaged form, so that the only symbolic relation between the sky and the turtle exists. Second, new correlation will be generated, because there is a third category of group has started to come up. So this is how totems, they get created, they get bifurcate, they may combine together. So this is a process, and whenever you try to tend to think of any change in any kind of society, you will see it in terms of certain totems. So that was about Levi-Strauss' view on totemism, basically, which was this was based on structuralism. Any questions? Any discussions? Or shall I move to the next? Because this time I have to actually complete 4 units in a class, because the classes given to me is quite less. So I was bit concerned about that. If there isn't any, I'll take up the next unit, that is on different forms of religion. That is your And today we will be talking about different religious communities, and we'll be talking about the Sikh community. And you all know that Sikhs, they constitute, they are not one of the most populous religious community in India, but they had their origin in India, and we always associate the teachings of Guru Nanak ji, with the origin of Sikhism. And Sikh religion, as such, it has gone through many critical phases, and you will see that Sikhism, when you talk about this religion, it's normally, we tend to associate it with the state of Punjab. But I had your diaspora classes with you, and today, if you talk about Sikhism, no doubt India was the place of its origin, but you will find it's all over the world. You will find the majority of the Sikhs in European countries, Canada, USA, Australia, they are all over. So it's not just, that 2% in India that constitutes only the percentage of Sikh. They have an international community, a religious community, and India could be the place of its origin. But today, let's not restrict the Sikhs only to India. They have a very diverse base today. And if you look at, the relationship between the state of Punjab and Sikh, it's intimate because mostly these Sikhs, they speak Punjabi. Punjabi is their mother tongue. And when you talk about, the religious teachings, it comes from the gurus. And the sacred text is called Guru Granth Sahib. And there is also the religious teachings, they are drawn from the Akal Takht. And the appearance of a Sikh, I don't have to go into it, because apart from the turban, there is this kada, the 5K that normally we associate a Sikh with. So MacLeod actually defined, he says that he has dealt with this question of Sikhism, and he says that Sikhism can be defined as the fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man, because this is a kind of a religion that is, that appears masculine. That it will not be wrong to say that every religion is gendered. When we talk about the Shakti cult comes with Ma Durga, or it's a feminine image of religion. When you talk about Sikhism, it brings an idea of masculinity. It's completely a masculine. So that's the reason MacLeod is trying to say that that's the fatherhood of God. And when you talk about the teachings of Sikhism, we tend to associate with the first Guru, Guru Nanak Dev's teaching, and he has actually provided a guideline for individual and corporate life. For individual, he says that one needs to achieve union with God, the Vaheguru, through meditation, and one should read the sacred scriptures, reflect on the doctrines in everyday's life, and all six, they should view all men as brothers without looking into the issues of caste, race, and without any expectation of reward. They should serve others, and live a life of an ordinary person, and to have the notions of untouchability, magic, idol worship, superstitions. These are not very not accepted in the teachings of Guru Nanak Dev. And for the corporate life, it was believed that the Sikhs would maintain a code of conduct, and they should accept the path of the community, the path that has been given by the Gurus to serve the community with all devotion. And at the same time, they should proclaim the Guru's teachings to the world. They should pass it on. They should accept the affection of the Nanak Panthis, those who have actually taken up the paths of Nanak, and you know, and their hearts should be filled with sympathy, respect, and love for others, and they should observe, in these rituals should be observed in gurudwaras and other shrines, and there has been additional views like Naam Japo, Kriya Karo, Van Japo. These are some of the divine uh, uh, tasks that's inculcated in Sikhism. And if you look at the gurus, Nanak Dev was the first guru who appeared during 1469 to 1539, and Guru Gobind Singh, he was the 10th guru, and he appeared from 1666 to 1708. And if you look at the tradition of Sikh gurus from Guru Nanak Dev and the scholars, who are trying to study Sikhism, they found that Guru Nanak's teachings were, they found the base of this religion of Sikhism, and uh, if you look at the ideas, thoughts, and actions of Guru Nanak Ji, it was meant to promote Sikhism, and in the due course of promoting Sikh religion, Guru Nanak, toured several places, met variety of scholars and some other religions, and he actually, he in his intellectual journey, he could actually meet a number of people from different backgrounds, and he could visit places, and that could be the one of the reasons why you find these this as we have already seen in our diaspora paper, that the migrating trade genes are there among the Sikh, because just remember, it was during the 15th century he could travel places in order to spread Sikhism, and if you talk about Guru Nanak Ji, you will see that you know uh, some there were some significant people who knew him, and they had their own ways, and they have you know conveyed us about his life through the contributions. They are known as Janam Sakhis in the Sikh tradition, and Nanak Ji's life has at least such Janam Sakhis that are available, and they are uh, they are called the Bhai Gurdas, Puratan Janam Sakhis, and Mihar Bahan Janam Sakhis. So, you will see that, according to the description available in the Sakhis, you will see that he visited several religious places on festive occasions. I mean, he could visit Mount Sumeru, Makkah, Medina, Baghdad. I mean, he was not, deterrent to any kind of place that, it's something that may not be approachable. He could, he could meet people of different race, different religion, and different ethnicity. And there were instances of some, debates that took place between Nanak Ji and other religious leaders. And in one such discourses, he pointed out that Hindus and Muslims, when they refer to Ram and Rahim respectively, they actually mean one and the same. So it was basically, a kind of a cohesive religion that was trying to bring unity among different clans. And if you look at the origin of, or if you critically try to examine the Sikh tradition, you will find syncretic traditions of both Hinduism and Islam in Sikhism. And that's the reason, you'll find such discourses in the what you say, in the speeches of Nanak Dev. And looking back into Nanak Dev, you will see that this person was inclined towards spirituality even at the age of 5. And seeing this phenomena in action, Hindus thought that he is perhaps an incarnation of God in human form, and Muslims thought him that he is also a true follower. So basically, when I say that Sikhism is a syncretic tradition of both Hinduism and Islam, the reason is that, basically during those days when Nanak Ji was born, uh, you will see that there were only two dominant religion that was found in India, that was Islam and Hinduism, and both of them thought that he is an incarnation of their own gods. So, of late, later on, his parents got him married, but he started showing withdrawal tendency. He never showed much interest in worldly activities, and he was invited by Nawab Daulat Khan of Sultanpur, who was very impressed by him, and he was, given the status of messenger of God for the divine court, and that's why he was given a cup of nectar that is called amrit, with a command to drink it with my name now, and he did it and returned to the world to preach the divine name. So that is why we still have this kind of tradition in Sikhism where amrit is given, and those people are, those persons are supposed to be, you know considered to be the messengers of God. And talking about the gurus, you will see that details are found in these Janam Sakis, the three Janam Sakis that I mentioned earlier, and this tradition was actually established by Nanak Ji, and that's the reason we call it Nanak Panth. All gurus up to Guru Gobind Singh were followers of it, and Nanak Panthis are nothing but it constitutes a local group of people who actually sing the hymns of the Guru hymns, and they have their satsangs which are held at dharmsalas, and it doesn't have any caste discrimination. People from different caste backgrounds can join these satsangs, and the Punjabi community, which was otherwise divided along caste lines, was seen united by observing these satsangs. So that was, that gave a new dimension to the Punjabi community, a religion that was based on equality and uniformity and unity irrespective of ethnicity, caste, and religion. And here we could see that Sikh religion was a strong force, because it displayed unity among various castes. And the same time, you will find that on the one hand, each one was well aware of his caste identity with the larger Punjabi community, but at the same time, that thing was completely uh, it was not looked into whenever you have these kind of conglomerations. And the Sikh Gurus, they visited several places, during the festive occasions. And one important name that needs to be mentioned was of Amritsar, where Guru Arjan, the fifth Guru, supervised the compiling of the sacred scriptures for the Panth. And it was in the 17th century when Hargobind succeeded his father Arjan as the sixth Guru, and he was called Guru Hargobind. And he came across different conditions of the society, and it was the period when Sikh Guru had come, out of the earlier environment where gurus were confined to dharmasalas or religious, visits outside. So some significant changes could be seen during this period, and Hargobind symbolically is uh, referred to two swordswomen, referring to spiritual authority, and the other referring to the newly achieved temporal power. So, on the basis of that spiritual authority that is called Piri, and the temporal power that is called Miri, a new building known as Akal Takht was erected. And Akal Takht, it faces the Harmandir Sahib, that is the golden temple that you see in Amritsar. Mostly you might have seen it in the TV or you might have visited it. You will see that it reflected a transformation within the Sikh Panth. And scholars like MacLeod, they have referred to this militant tradition to the earlier existing Jat culture. And during the middle years of the 17th century, and it appeared as if the Sikh tradition might return back to its earlier stage of religious glory. But then one important incident happened. Guru Tegh Bahadur, the ninth Guru, he faced a difficult time, and he allowed himself to sacrifice his life at the hands of the Mughal rulers. And he and along with his brave men, he could actually rise against the tyranny of the Mughal period of those times. And fearing the same fate, some Sikhs they chose to remain silent. And but the next Guru of the Sikhs, that was Guru Gobind Singh, came heavily against this cowardice activity of the Sikhs. And he was suggesting that Sikhs should not hide themselves anymore, and they have to recognize their strength, because that is how why they have been born. They have certain purpose in life, and he symbolically suggested the use of still in their hands and still in the soul of the path. So that is how sword it became an important part of the Sikh lifestyle after this preaching of Guru Gobind Singh. And he also decided to do away with the earlier experiment of decentralization of power, and demanded that everybody needs to commit himself to this central authority created by the Sikhs, and they required to become members of the Khalsa of Guru Gobind Singh. And they have moved to discontinue this tradition of appointing Sikh gurus, and he was considered to be the last guru. In this way, Guru Gobind Singh was the 10th and the last guru. At the beginning of the 19th century, you will see Ranjit Singh, he conquered Lahore. He became Maharaja of Lahore in 1801. And since then, Raj Karega Khalsa prophecy, you know, uh, Waheguru Ki Fateh. Today you have these slogans. It became very popular during those times, during the 19th century when Ranjit Singh conquered Lahore. And after the Anglo-Sikh War in Punjab that took place in 1849, the conflicts of the Sikhs with Mughals and the Afghans as well as the Britishers could be seen all along history. I mean, all over history you will find these conflicts with Sikhs getting involved in these kind of struggling situations. And if we look at the interaction of Sikhism with other faiths, you will see that throughout history, Sikhism had intimately interacted with Hinduism and Islam. There are some other instances also like caste factors, coming in the way of Sikhism, but you will see that everyone within Sikh religion, they were aware of his or her caste origin. And we have also seen that at religious places and at the dharmasalas, the gurus never allowed any discrimination. They will be eating together, the same food would be cooked for everyone, and the Sikh tradition has a typical combination of religion and caste. And one such combination of Sikh religion with Jat culture can also be seen. It's noted in various popular writings that there is no dispute, however, among the scholars that the origin of the Jats was with that. And at the same time, Khuswant Singh has argued that Jats brought about the Panchayat system in which five senior members of the community were commanded the supreme power of the village. So, as such, if you talk about the Jat Sikhs, they have an enormous role. If you talk about the idea of village republic or small republics, because they were. Please mute the microphones. Please mute your microphone. Thank you. So basically, this idea of bringing the community together, of having a very democratic life, of having a community like this. The idea of this small republic, it came with this community, this particular Jat community. So they always valued the notions of freedom, equality, and they tried to keep themselves away from any kind of Brahminical influence of Hinduism, because that was famous in quite infamous rather in propagating certain discriminatory practices that Sikhism has always tried to avoid. And then the denigration of Jats by upper caste Hindus did not result in lowering down the position of the Jats in their own eyes, because they started taking up their status to be equivalent with the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. The Jats were considered, they were born as workers and warriors, and they never freed the villages. And in case of invasion, they went for a revenge. In case of, if there was any case of molestation of their women, the Jat would never spare them. So the Punjabi Jats were already, known for risk taking. They could fight any odd situation, and the Jat connection with the Sikh community becomes very important. And that's the reason, when we identify Sikhism with militancy, because if you in, last week when we were trying to cover the diaspora paper, you will see that mostly the hazardous industries where the kind of heavy work was needed, they were actually appointing the Jats and the people from the Sikh community, because they were known as a community who had physical prowess, and it was considered to be a militant community. And it also, you will see that Jats are the only caste which is represented in Sikh religion. For example, Ramdaria Sikhs, they represented with the artisan community, and it constitutes an important section of the Sikh community. Then coming to their martial background, Sikh community, as I told you, it has always been a militant community, and they have fought battles. They have particularly lived as fight it out invaders, and throughout history you will find them in certain conflicting situations. They tried several you know permutation combinations to fight against the Afghan invaders, and one Afghan invader, Ahmad Shah Abdali, made at least 9 invasions. The Sikh sought the help of the rulers of Delhi and Marathas, and that was the biggest challenge that the Sikh community had against the Afghans. Even I think the latest, there was this movie by Akshay Kumar, Bollywood movie. I'm just missing out the name. It was again, the Sikh regiment. Of the 18th century, who were completely, without any weapon, but they were trying to fight out with the Afghans during the colonial times. I'm just missing out the name of the movie. That it is not a very old one, a recent one. So here you will see, the tradition of being in conflict with Afghan rulers has always been there, and Afghan rulers, they have in fact had several attempts for invading the Sikh rulers. And when you talk about Maharaja Ranjit Singh, he has actually disappointed their attempts many a times, and this has been discussed, in history, that how Punjab was consolidated into one state, and it could be attributed to the leadership of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And because he could prevent the Afghans, from invading the Punjab region on the other, and to fight against the Gurkhas, and thus restricting their influence only up to China. So consolidation of Punjab as a province, it had so many enemies, and the Sikh community always stood tall, and it could actually, make things in their favor. And the first Punjabi victory over Afghan, it came around 1813 with the Battle of Attao. So after the Afghans lost power in North India, they tried to push back their territory, and after the consolidation of the Punjabi power under the Maharaja Ranjit Singh, you will see that the relations between them and the emerging British power became quite cordial. But Punjabi leadership, especially, they were always aware of the British power, and the Sikhs they realized that sooner or later the British will also try to rule Punjab, and later on Punjab, British power later on the British power they tried to annex Punjab, and even the tussle started with them. The Britishers promised the rule of law in the land of Punjab and initiated some development work, and it was during the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 that the Sikhs took the side of the Britishers as a result of this, and more and more Sikhs were recruited in the army because the British were always aware that they are a formidable community. If you talk about physical prowess or militancy, they can go to any extent. So they were, always in a position to appease the Sikh community, and that's the reason, they recruited so many into their armies. And during the First World War, the Sikhs actually outnumbered about one-fifth of the total army. As a result of it, the Sikhs took British rulers. The number was, you know, some of them, although in very small numbers, they had an opportunity, to migrate to United States and Canada, and that actually creates, the linkage that has been there since the First World War, because the British always they took the Punjabi community, especially the Sikh community. By Punjabi, it has become completely synonymous with the Sikh community. They always had confidence in them, and that is how you have so many Pravasi Bharatiyas in Canada and America today. So, and the phenomena dates back to the First World War. And even in Australia, I told you that how it was, even during the period of indentured, even prior to that period, when gold mines were invented, that the Sikhs community were transported so that they can work in the mines, because nobody would have so much of physical strength and stamina as the Sikh community would be having. So that was one of the reasons. And so we just discussed the Sikh community, and I think I still have some time so that I can move on to the practices of Jainism and Buddhism. Because in this section I have to cover a lot, and I just have 3 classes left. So I'll try to take up some parts of the next unit, that is unit 16, and you will see that if you talk about the emergence of Buddhism and Jainism in ancient India, it dates back to the first millennium BC, and it was, you will see that, during the 6th century BC, when there was a period of religious turmoil in India, and simple religious life of ancient India was getting complicated. There was this prevalence of this Brahmanical system, which was getting tyrannical and with its discriminatory practices that was based on complicated sacrifices, ceremonies. It created certain kind of unrest among the common people, because the common man was not able to meet the requirements of the Brahmanical traditions that was getting so very hegemonic and dominant during the 6th century. For the caste system was another, rigid facet of inequality that was aggravating the society, and the Brahmins, by now they had taken up the status of being the highest rung in the society, and they started preaching the new philosophy of life and death, and they started advocating the ways of attaining moksha and how one should retain one's own karma. And at the same time, you will see that all these religious, ritualistic Brahmanic schools, they were associated with the earliest period of classical Hinduism. Prominent among them were Buddhism and Jainism, which emerged around 800 to 600 BC. They denied they did not accept that the Vedas are, the ultimate text, that determines the lifestyle of people here in India, and they denied the ritual significance of caste, and gave that that the Vedas were trying to preach that the ways in which caste practices needs to be propagated, how but people from particular sex group have to work. So they were actually in complete denial of all these things. And if you look at the history of Jainism, you will see that it originated during the ancient times, and Mahavir was the 24th and the last Tirthankara. Literally, it means code maker, and of the current age. And Tirthankars are also called Jinas. They are the revealers of Jain religion, and they were the ones who have crossed over life streams of rebirths and have set the example that all Jains must follow. So the Mahavir was actually the son of a Kshatriya chieftain, and he renounced his princely status, and he took up a life of asceticism at the age of 30. After about a period of 12 years, he suffered the most self-denying hardships until he finally, reached a stage where he started to teach others, preach others. So there remains no objective document actually when we talk about the beginning of Jainism. We actually don't have any chronicled documented data because it dates back to the ancient times. And the death of Mahavir, that is the entry into Nirvana, which was the starting point of traditional Jain chronicle, it corresponds to 527 to 26 BC. However, some scholars believe that it could be 1 century later, and Mahabir, he perceived him as the last revealer in this age, and he had 11 disciples, and his disciples were called Ganadharas, all of whom were Brahmin converts into Jainism, and all of them they founded the monastic lineages, but only two, that was Indrabhuti Gautama and Sudarman, disciples who survived Mahavir and served as points of origin for the historical Jain monastic community. Uh, this is there was this movement among this community, and the most significant division, that is the Svetambara means white robe, and the Digambara means they are called sky clad, or that is naked. It persists even today, and the major point of difference between the two concerns is that the question of proper monastic attire, whether or not a soul can attain liberation from female body, a possibility that the Digambaras deny. So they are more conservative when you talk about the Digambaras. These differences were formalized with a series of councils that tried to codify the teachings that was written by Mahavir during his lifetime, and it was felt that the teachings that was preserved orally was actually in danger because people were having different interpretations to it. And four councils were held between 4th century to 5th century AD, and the last one that was held at Saurashtra, now in Gujarat, it codified the Svetambara canon, which is still in use. So the Gambaras, they deny the authenticity of this corpus. They say that it's a recent creation, and it has lost its authenticity. But they claim to be the authentic inheritors of Mahavir's teaching. So that is how the rift between these two groups that still continues. After Mahavir's time, we will see that the Jain community, they could spread out to all parts, to west to south, and they claim to enjoy the favors of many rulers. The king of Magad was one of the patrons. The Maurya dynasty, Chandragupta Maurya, by 5th century, the Digambaras were influential in the Deccan, especially in Karnataka. Then under the Gangas and the Rashtrakutas, the Jain culture, it actually flourished. And the Swetambaras, especially in Gujarat, they were quite famous. Ramchandra served as a minister in the kingdom, and he could actually, many sanctuaries were created during those times, the such as in Mount Abu now in Rajasthan. Then there is you will see certain the sect actually could rise. That is the Swetambara sect, and it was during the Mughal period. You know, when during Akbar's time they could actually have a great influence, and today you will see that the Jain community never regained its former valor or glory. Nowadays, the Digambaras that they are established now in mostly Maharashtra, Karnataka, and you will find the Swetambaras in Punjab, Rajasthan, and Gujarat. And in modern times, Swetambaras they maintain an organization. They have a monastic community, and both communities devote much time in maintaining these temples and monasteries and in the religious text. And traditionally, the Jains, they are basically the mercantile people, and basically they are traders who can adapt themselves to different environments and societies. And that's the reason you will see that many Jains, they have actually now overseas Indians, they have migrated elsewhere. And now among the international community, among the not only among the diaspora, but among there is an international awareness of Jainism. They are everywhere now, and they are making an attempt to target their religion. And if you talk about their practices, you will see that all Jains are members of the fourfold congregation, that is Sangha, and it is composed of monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. They have this common belief in three ratna, that is the three jewels. Uh, First is right faith, right knowledge, right conduct. And observance of these three jewels, it provides the conditions for attainment of the goal, which is liberation from bondage. And you will see that it can be attained by the Jain monk who is free from all bondages, internal or external bondages. You don't have any desires, you don't have any worldly commitments. So there are certain ideal practices that are in force for the male members of the religious community. And uh, but at the same time, householders are permitted certain ceremonies such as worship of images, a practice that they have picked up from Hinduism. And both lay, the monastic followers, they take these brothers, they take this oath, vows, and that they would stick to the basics of Jain ethics and diets as a pious believer. And mostly the monks and the nuns, they take actually 5 vratas, that is called Mahavratas, and they pledge that they would abstain from injuring life, false speech, taking what is not given, unchastity, appropriation. And the sixth vow consists of abstaining from taking food and drink at night, with the aim to avoid injury to insects, which might go unnoticed. So that's the reason they don't take anything, they don't eat anything at night. They wear that mask like thing, which was very common these days with us also. So when you talk about the ordinary monks who live in the company of others, like they benefit from the advice of the superiors. And this company that is called the Gana is subdivided into smaller units as well. And if you look at the right religious conduct, it has certain codes of conduct, that is giving rules for habitation, wandering, begging, for confession, for penances, for everything you have a guideline. The begging tour is also an important aspect of this community, and members have no possession, and hence it is minutely codified. Begging and fasting must be conducted with great care, and confession, that is called alochana or repentance, they are also an essential part of this community life. Then you have listeners and servants, that is Sravakas and Upasakas. The lay believers also they take the five main vows, that is the Mahavrata, and hence they are called Anuvratas, lesser vows. They include Ahimsa, that is non-violence, Satya, truthfulness, and Dana, that is charity. So, if you look at the practices and the doctrines, that it emphasizes on individual exertion, and it considers that the giants to be inaccessible, they have to liberate their souls. And on the other hand, if you look at the giant community, they have not been able to ignore the devotional aspect that they have picked from Hindu rituals. So all these practices are believed to lead the soul to achieve its own perfection. That is called siddhi, and that is how that becomes one of the major goals of the Jain practices. Now, talking about the religious goal. Eternal liberation, that is non-attachment to any kind of worldly life, or eternal desire is completely, it's something that they actually from completely. And to understand how the Jainas perceive and address the problem of impediments towards the liberation of soul is to explain that explain the Jainas conception of reality actually. And today, it is, you will see that they have this symbol of will with 12 spokes called aras, means ages. 6 making an ascending arc where man progresses in knowledge, age, stature, happiness, and 6 non descending ones where he deteriorates. And the two cycles joined together make one rotation of a wheel, that is called kalpa. So if you look at the Jainas, they have inhabited the universe into 5 parts. The lower world, that is Adhaloka, it's subdivided into 7 tiers, each one darker and torturous. Then the middle one, Madhyalok, consists of numerous concentric continents separated by seas. The central continent, that is Jambudvipa, human beings occupy it. And then the celestial world, that is called the Urdhvaloka, and it consists of 2 categories. The apex of the occupied universe is Siddhasila, the crescent-shaped abode of liberated souls, that is Siddhas. The Siddhas go and reside in that heaven, that is called the Siddhasila. So these are some of the important components of this Jain doctrine. And if you look at you know there are actually 5 characteristics of the soul, that is they call the jiva, and that is consciousness, bliss, and energy. And you will see that the jiva possesses these qualities in infinite measure, and it can be divided into the 2 embodied states, that is mobile and immobile, and according to the number of sense organs possessed by the body they inhabit. So the Jains believe that there are 4 elements, and so are also they are animated by the souls. So that's the reason you will find that there is a belief that matter furnishes into a soul, and it's incorporated into certain corporeal functions, and there are these 5 kind of bodies, each having different functions. So at least they have this karmic body which results from previous action, and they believe in the transmigration, incarnation of soul, and again freeing oneself from all kinds of bondage, and trying to free the body, the mind, and that remains very core to the Jain doctrine. Uh, you will see that the process of bondage of liberation, it can be summarized into certain categories. One is jiva, influx of karmic matter into the jiva, bondage, then stoppage of that karmic influx, and expulsion, that is nirjara. So, and then comes total liberation. So these are the very processes through which bondage and liberation, the passage from bondage to liberation takes place. Talking about the symbols and certain iconography that exists in this Jain religion, you will see that however, there are certain descriptions of stupas and pillars, tree signs that incorporates the Jaina text, and they have certain distinctive features. The Jain shrine is the image of the Tirthankara to whom it is dedicated, and you will see that there are certain auspicious symbolic diagrams like the will, the Jaina law that represents the Jaina law. Then there are the arhats, the siddhas. So these are certain symbolic forms in which they are represented. Then you have many Jaina temples all around, and stupas were among the first monuments that were erected by the Jain community. And soon, the Buddhists they also started having stupas. So, the origin of stupas it basically belongs to the Jain community. And throughout the ages, you will find that there has been what you say the minority they have as a minority they have occupied uh, you know they have always been a minority in India and elsewhere, and the spread of Jainism it is largely confined to India, and it's quite a progressive community, and we still have 5-7 minutes. So talking about, I'll just give you a brief intro to Buddhism. You will see that Buddhism focus was basically on the teachings of Gautam Buddha, who was born in Kapilavastu, that is in Nepal now, and he came, he appeared around 5th century BC, and it could spread all over the Indian subcontinent in the next 5 centuries, Central South Asia, East Asia, in the next 2 millennia. And it could actually undergo, certain changes because of missionary diffusions throughout South Asian countries, and, it could also win the patronage of certain monarchs, and that was the reason it could spread out so easily. So if you look at the distinctions between the major historical forms of Buddhism, it has centered on threefold typology. It is based on certain doctrinal and institutional differences, which falls into certain geographical areas. One that is located in Southeast Asia, it is mostly comprising of Ceylon, Burma, Thailand. Next is in Nepal, Sikkim, China, Korea, and Japan region. And the third is mostly Tibet, Mongolia, and parts of Siberia. So if you look at the first category, that is the Theravada, it has certain canonical literature associated with it, which has institutionalized, trying to give a order to the monastic life. And on the other hand, there is this Mahayana, which is a diffuse and it's a complex combination of several schools and sects, and it is based on certain heterogeneous literature. And then there is the stigmatized category, which is called the Hinayana. Hina means small vehicle. Maha means big. So this is about Tantric Buddhism. It is mostly dominated in Tibetan area, and there you will see that this Tantric teachings which originated in India, it persisted in several so-called Mahayana schools in Japan and China, and in its Tibetan form, Buddhism was richly fused with the idea of primitivism that was associated with their own society. So that's how it existed all through. Talking about the doctrines of Buddhism, you will see that Buddha literally means the enlightened one, and that is how we called Siddhartha become Buddha when he became enlightened, and he started he renounced his worldly life, his kingdom, and he passed into a state of nirvana, which literally means without any desire. So, a state of being completely desireless. So, if you look at the major forms of, tradition which is there in Buddhist teaching, you have certain, what you will say, practical yoga, which follows some, some middle part between extreme bodily indulgence and self modification. Please mute your microphones.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
So, students, any questions to ma'am?
I haven't yet finished yet. I just need a minute or two to just wind up, sir.
Continue.
Okay, I'll just wind up in a minute or two because
Continue,
I'm just
continue,
okay.
continue, continue.
Well, I'll just take 2-3 minutes more. So basically, what Buddhism trying to teach, it says that you abstain from all kinds of uh, indulgence, all kinds of desires. You just negate all kinds of desires and lead a path of intellectualism. And Buddha says that life exists in sorrow and suffering, and which is actually caused by desire. So if you put an end to your desire, there will be an end to the sufferings, all kinds of suffering. So basically, he is talking about certain austerities in terms of suffering. He believes that all creatures, they are marked by suffering and they have certain bondage. And the cause of suffering is nothing but desire. And cessation suffering is the cessation of desire. And this is how he is talking about the eightfold path. And the eightfold path is all about doing away with all kinds of desire. And Buddha has recommended certain path which consists of the right viewpoint, right values. He's talking about right speech, right actions, livelihood, and right efforts. And in the process, he is actually it's a community. It's a community which it's basically a community that goes on spreading, and they have a routinized and a very disciplined life. And they still maintain it till date. They maintain that kind of a thing. So I think I will wind up today right now, and we'll talk about the historical development of Buddhism. We'll take it up next class, and I will take up the next block tomorrow. So sir, we will be winding up right now. If any participant has any doubt, we can just come up with any clarification, or you want to give any suggestion, or you want have any comments to make, please come up with, or else we'll just wind up.
So, students, any questions to ma'am? Speak something, yeah. You just don't like this. I mean, only spectator, okay? Don't be silent spectator. You should speak something. If any doubt, any clarification, you don't have any doubt?
No, sir.
Okay. I mean, how do you feel? The class is all right?
Yes, sir. The class is all right, sir.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your nice presentation. So tomorrow, same time, you will join. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank
You,
you,
sir.
students.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It will more. It will more.